Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation on the 10th of November. Today we have a lot of updates, so let's start. Of course we're going to start with the Kherson district. As you can see, according to the Western Sources map, you see a lot of blue flags, blue icons with the white flags. Inside of those icons means that all these towns that were taken back by the Ukrainians. Today we got a lot of reports, a lot of video confirmation from all these towns that Ukrainians are putting their flags in these towns, that Ukrainian civilians from this area are greeting with the Ukrainians and so on. The Russians are stepping back, but there is a thing that we haven't seen during the day. There is one important thing that we haven't seen during the day, and I'm talking about heavy clashes on Kherson district, encirclement of the Russian forces in Kherson district, like destroyed Russian convoys in Kherson district, and so on. So, as you can see, as I told you yesterday, it's highly unlikely that the Russians are able to cross the Dnieper River and to leave this bank of the river without agreement with the Ukrainians. But today I got a report from the Russian sources that says why the Ukrainians didn't attack the Russians during the day while crossing the river. The thing is that the Russians are saying that all the HIMARS systems that were given to the Ukrainians as a Western help is under complete Western control, under complete control by the US forces and so on. And this is the reason why the Ukrainians or the Western countries haven't used the HIMARS systems against the Russian forces because of the agreement in negotiation process between Sullivan and the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation. They had an agreement, and as a result of those agreement, the Russians agreed to leave this area. But the Western countries, or to be more precise, Sullivan promised that the Russians won't be attacked, their convoys won't be attacked by HIMARS system. Because it's unbelievable that if you have such a possibility, I'm talking about the Ukrainians, to destroy the Russian army on this bank of the river and not to do this. So that means that there was an agreement, but the most important that there was an agreement not between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The agreement was between the Western countries and the Russian Federation. Today we got a lot of reports from the Ukrainian military and policy authorities. They were talking about that they're not attacking, they're not running for the Russians because of the fact that all this area is mined by the Russians. Believe me, if this territory is mined by the Russians, the Ukrainians know exactly the places where those mines are. Also, the Ukrainians were telling during the day that it's a trap. It's highly unlikely that the Russians are going to leave this area. It's highly unlikely that the Russians are going to give up in Kherson and so on. Zelensky told us the same thing, that he didn't believe that the Russians are leaving this area. You need to understand that all those things that the Ukrainian authorities were talking to its civilians is just to give them like opinion why they're not running for the Russians. Because there are a lot of smart people in Ukraine as well who understand, who saw the situation in Kharkiv district on the north of Kharkiv area. If you remember, during the previous counteroffensive operation, we haven't saw any updates about, let's say, like encirclement, destroying the big losses from the Russians during the counteroffensive operation. We haven't saw anything like that. So it also was some kind of maybe a part of some big global deal between the Russians and the Western countries, or with the United States of America. And they needed to provide some information for the Ukrainians to explain them why the Russians are running, but why we are not reducing them as much as possible. Because they can't tell to the Ukrainians that there is a negotiation process between the Western countries and the Russian Federation about this situation and so on. They can't tell this. Nobody can tell this, so that's why everybody tries to play its role in this game. Now let's talk about the evacuation process. As you can see, the Ukrainians got control over, let's say, the farthest towns, farthest checkpoints in this area, like Alexandrovka, towns around Snegirivka. Today we got report that Ukrainians got control over Bruskinskaya. This map has been updated already with the flag, and they're moving further. Today we haven't received any update from the Russian side how many forces they managed to evacuate from this area, but we still have reports that in the evening of the local time there are still lines near Kherson of the civilians who are trying to cross the river and so on. Anyway, this process is going to take a lot of time. maybe a few days, not like a lot of time, like months, but another few days this operation is going to take. And the thing is that the most important, I believe, is the final day when the Ukrainians are going to reach the suburbs, outskirts of this town Kherson. The question is whether there are going to be any clashes and battles around Kherson, or the Russians are planning to evacuate without even a shot. So this is the situation about Kherson. I analyzed this situation about this evacuation process for a very long time, and of course we understand that if the Russians left this bank of the river, that means that the Russians gave us an answer to the question whether the Russians were planning to get control over Nikolaev and, the most important, over Odessa. And we understand that the answer to this question is no. The Russians are no longer planning to take control over these two towns. Maybe in the future, maybe with some kind of other type of attack, or maybe in the another conflict with Ukraine, they will try. But at least in the next months, I believe that the Russians are not planning to take control over this town. Now let's discuss about the words of Surovikov, who yesterday said that now the Russians are moving towards more reliable position on this bank of the river, and let's discuss this reliable position. First of all, let's take a look at the Russian sources map, and I will show you one important thing. There is this Kherson, as you can see, a lot of icons. The Russian source map has been updated as well, at least at some places, and so on. And we can split this area in two parts. The first one is Kherson district, and the second one is the South Kherson, or the left bank of the river Dnieper. The thing is that main bases, main ammo depot, and headquarters were located on this bank of the river, that located very far from the front line, and the most important, they were out of range of the US HIMARS rockets. And there are a number of bases that located in this area, and one of the most important Russian base was located in the town by the name of Chaplinka. As you can see, there is like a small warehouse, a place for aircrafts and so on. And today we got some pictures from the satellites showing like the situation on this base, like before the retreat process and after this process, and the base is totally empty. So the Russians were forced to move their bases from this side of Kherson district, or towards Crimea, or towards Melitopol. Now let's back here, and we can split, let's say, this area. First of all, let's take a look. So we understand that at least the Ukrainians have a big number of rockets that are able to attack that have range more than 80 kilometers. And 80 kilometers, that's a lot. And as you can see, we will try to build some kind of red line that the Russians can't enter this red line. The area that located, let's say, on the left side from this red line. So now we see the approximate area where the Russians are no longer able to have their forces and so on. So as you can see, this is a very big territory. So the Russians, if we're talking about this area, need to evacuate all their warehouses and headquarters from this bank of the river, from this area, and that's a lot, and they don't have much territories. Yes, as you can see, Melitopol, Genichevsk, small towns. It's like the biggest towns in this area in Zaporozhye, Kherson district, Melitopol, Genichevsk. This is the area where the Russians are able to have something. But if we take a look at Zaporozhye, we can calculate another 80 kilometers. Yes, Melitopol. So there are not much territories. There is a small line between Mariupol and Melitopol that the Russians and this area are able to use as the bases, the warehouses, because the Ukrainians don't have weapon or missiles to get this area, or at least the United States of America, at least officially, haven't provided them this type of weapon. Is it much or is it not enough? I believe that, of course, it's enough. It's enough to deploy your forces, to deploy armored vehicles, warehouses, depot, and so on. And there is Mariupol, big town, Berdyansk port, there is Melitopol, Genichevsk. There are a lot of places where the Russians still able to have forces. But Now let's take a look at another thing, in this area. The thing is, the most difficult situation now from now on is about this territory. The territory between Nova Kakhovka, Achakov, Nova Kakhovka, Kherson. So this area, just I'm try to show you this one. This triangle, this square, is the most difficult for the Russians because all this area is under very heavy fire, and there is a very big road, there is a very big distance between the Russian supply center sources and, let's say, with this area. Now there is a very high chance, a very high risk that Ukrainians, and they do have very high chances to start their offensive operation in this direction, and they will be able to take control over this part of Kherson district easily. Of course, I'm not sure that Ukrainians are able to move their infantry, that they are able to send their tanks, armored vehicles or something like this, but with infantry, light infantry, they will be able to take control over this part of Kherson district, I believe, without big problems. And this is a very big problem for the Russians because from their side, they need to send reinforcement, infantry, tanks, and all this territory will be under real Ukrainian fire control, and there are not much roads that leads to this area. So the situation is very difficult, and I'm not sure that we can believe the words of Suvorivikov, the head of the special operation, that they're moving towards more reliable position. I'm not sure about this. At least we just discussed this part of Kherson district, and the Ukrainians do have very high chances to establish a real bridgehead on this bank of the river, and from this side they are able to develop their offensive operation towards Crimea. And now we can say that we used to talk about 4 front lines like official front lines in this area, like Svatov front line, Seversk Bakhmut front line, let's say South Donetsk front line, and Kherson front line. For now on, there are no more Kherson front line, and I believe that starting today, we can talk about Crimea front line. Yes, we see that the Ukrainians don't have bridgehead in this area, but I believe that now they have very high chances to get this bridgehead, or we are the witnesses of the beginning of the process of when this conflict is going to be ended. And as we discussed, maybe the stepping back from Kherson is the part of a very big deal. I'm not sure that Ukrainians are going to agree to stop this conflict without Zaporozhye power plant. They need this power plant for many reasons, and one of them because this is the biggest power plant in Europe, and with help of this power plant, the Ukrainians are able at least to sell electricity to the Russians and to supply and support their own regions and to have at least some income and so on. We discussed this situation many times, so I believe if there is an agreement to stop this conflict, maybe the Russians will be forced to leave the Zaporozhye power plant. We understand that this is not a very good option for them, but maybe they will establish some kind of protocols or some kind of rules how the Ukrainians are able to. Maybe there will be some forces from the Russian side and some forces from the Ukrainian side. Maybe there are going to be some checkpoints, and that only the civilians will be there and something like this. Who knows? But we're going to see, I believe, the next months, we're going to see all the situation in this area. Now, let's move next. The Russians reported that the Russians haven't provided any report about the losses from the Ukrainian side during the previous 24 hours clashes in this area. Maybe there were some clashes, and today we got a lot of the updates about, let's say, Russian Lend-Lease in this area. They left a lot of tanks, a lot of armored vehicles, equipment, and we got a lot of videos when the Ukrainians were moving these a little bit damaged vehicles to their service centers, and the Ukrainians got another line of weapon armored vehicles, so nice for them, of course. Now we are moving to another front lines. If we are talking about the Zaporozhye front line, there are no changes as well. And today we finally got control, some explanation about the situation near Pavlovka. Of course, this update is not so big in comparison with the updates we received from Kherson district, but the Russians report that they managed to, after 13 days of storming in this area, they managed to establish control over entire Pavlovka. If we take a look at the Western sources map, at least I believe that the Russians established control over the part that located on this side of the river Kashlagach. I'm not sure that the Russians managed to establish control over the part that located on that side of the river, but anyway, at least some progress. But the Russian sources are saying that there is no need, this Pavlovka is useless without a continue of storming process in direction of Ugledar. Also, the Ukrainians made a few attempts of counter-offensive operation in direction of Mykolaiv. That confirms that Mykolaiv is under Russian control, because according to the Western sources, this town is under Ukrainians. And today, the Ukrainians tried to attack Mykolaiv from the back, from in front, but the attack were repulsed, and the Ukrainians lost around 55 soldiers and 3 armored vehicles. Now there are a few towns that the Russians will, if they are planning to develop their offensive operation in this area, there are at least 3 towns that the Russians will try to take control over. The first one, of course, is Perechistovka, this one. This town, I'm not sure how they're planning to do this, but anyway, I believe that we're going to see the counter-offensive operation in this area from the Russian side, or offensive operation as well. Another area is Ugledar, but the Russians are not going to attack from Pavlovka. They will try to develop their offensive operation from the direction of Mykolaiv to Vadiane, and of course Novomikhailovka. The Russians need to take these 3 towns: Perechistovka, Ugledar, and Novomikhailovka. These are the focal towns, and if the Russians are able to penetrate the Ukrainian defense orders in this area, some part of Ukrainian defense will be collapsed as well with that success. If we are talking about Donetsk, there are no changes. There are no changes in Peski front line. There are no changes in Marinka. The Russian source map hasn't been updated. I believe that there are attacks. There are storming processes. The Russians are storming. They're trying to penetrate, but at least for now, without any progress. If we are talking about Avdiivka, there are still no changes in this area, and now we're moving to New York, Toretsk, Bakhmut frontline. There are no changes as well. As you can see, by the way, another important thing about, as you can see, during the previous week, we haven't seen a lot of massive, let's say, rocket or missiles attack against the Ukrainian facilities, Ukrainian army. We saw a few attacks with the usage of the Shahed drones and something like this, but as you can see, the Russians reduced their missiles, Kalibr attacks, Iskander attack as much as possible. And some sources are saying that this is also part of a big deal between the Western countries, the United States of America and the Russian Federation. And as you can see, the Russians stopped attacking the Ukrainian energy facilities. Some sources, Russian sources, provided some kind of interesting information, and that this big deal has few steps, and both parties are doing steps by step, one after another. And the first step was that the Russians stopped their attacking of Ukrainian energy facilities. The next step was that Ukrainians promised not to attack the Russians while stepping back, retreating on this back of the river. The next step, we can see right now, the Russians started their evacuation process from this bank of the river. The next step should be, according to this big deal, according to some Russian sources, or at least this step is connected with towns, maybe with towns or fortress like Avdiivka or Bakhmut. So some Russian sources are saying that if the next days we are going to see, let's say, the evacuation process of the Ukrainians from Bakhmut, of course, the Russians will announce that they achieved significant success, that they penetrate the Ukrainians and force them to step back, and the Ukrainians will cry that the situation is bad and we were forced to leave this area. But believe me, it won't be like this, and if we're going to see such process during the next days, that means that this is another step from the Western countries according to this big deal. Of course, if we're talking about the Russians, I'm not sure they need Bakhmut, but they have already ended this town, so I believe that they will try to complete this step. The most important thing for the Russians is, of course, Avdiivka. I'm not sure that the Ukrainians want to risk their situation with Avdiivka, but who knows what is going to be next. And of course, we understand that the Western countries have a lot of options how to press Zelensky authorities to step back from this area. But if we're talking about current situation, we don't have any flags or any signs that Ukrainians are in a very bad situation in Avdiivka, and at least they can show a picture that because of bad situation they were forced to step back. Maybe the Ukrainians will give such a possibility for the Russians on the south of Donetsk area. Maybe this situation with Pavlovka was a part of big deal. Maybe the Ukrainians won't. Also, they can't say, the Ukrainians, that we are planning to sign agreements with the Russians and give them these territories. Of course, they need at least to show some picture, because we understand that the Ukrainians are not those people who will live with this lie. And of course, if they are able, and they will try to do everything to stop the Ukrainian authorities. Maybe this is the part also of the big deal, and a part of big deal when the Ukrainians will be forced to leave Donetsk and to stop shelling this town. And for these purposes, we understand that Ukrainians needed to be pushed back to Pokrovsk, to this town. At least from this area, the Ukrainians won't be able to attack Donetsk, or at least they will be able to do this, but with the HIMARS rockets. But in this case, the Russians will be able at least to shut down at least 80-90% from those rockets, and I'm not sure that the Ukrainians will attack Donetsk from that moment. So maybe the next days we are going to see the evacuation process of the Ukrainians on the line between Bakhmut, Konstantinovka, Pokrovsk. So to push the Ukrainians as much as possible from the residential area of Russian Federation. So we need to follow this situation, because we know that Russians reported that the forces located on Kherson district will be moved to another front lines for offensive operations. Of course, the Russians start offensive operation, with the reading quotes, and the Ukrainians will be forced to step back because of big pressure and so on. So this is the next step. This is the next step, maybe possible next step of this big deal between these two powers, to leave the territory around Donetsk. I believe that it's very, very possible. I'm not sure that we are going to see any changes on Kupiansk front line, because if we take a look at this map, the front line moves along the LPR border. The Russians left Kharkiv district. They didn't make any referendum in this area. So I believe that this front line is going to be stable. And I believe that if there is a big deal, the Russians won't return Liman. The question, if we're talking about, let's say, Liman-Kupiansk front line, the Ukrainians made the same attempts trying to attack Kuzyumovka. The Ukrainians were trying to attack the same towns like Pashanka and Chervonopopovka, and so on. But all those attacks were repulsed by the Russians. Ukraine lost around 160 soldiers and something around 9 armored vehicles. And that's it about the situation on the ground. And another important update about the steps. As soon as the Ukrainians left the suburbs on the area around Donetsk, then it's time to sign documents. And maybe as soon as the Ukrainians left the north part of Donetsk, one of the steps or possible step is that the Russians will demilitarize the Zaporozhye power plant, and after that we're going to see a signing of some kind of agreement that will determine the future of Ukraine and the future of possible upcoming conflicts in Ukraine during the next upcoming 10 or 20 years. If there are going to be, if we're talking about the Russians, I'm not sure that the Russians wants to have any war in Ukraine after this war. They achieved everything they needed, and the most important thing that they needed is that they managed to establish ground connection with Crimea. Now there is no risk. They are able to support this area. Furthermore, they have restored the water supply and support in Crimea. As you can see, this very important blue line, this is the water, because Crimea doesn't have its own water, or this water is not enough to support the population of civilians. And starting from 2014, there was a lot of problems with the water, but as soon as the Russians got control of the south of Kherson district, they managed to restart the supply and support of this area with the water from the Dnieper River. And so they solved all their problems. Also, they solved the problem with Ukraine. They reduced its industry, and now Ukraine needs a lot of time to restore its economy, to restore everything it have, and so on. Of course, if we're talking about relations between Ukraine and the Russian Federation, I believe the next 100 years, or maybe 500 years, or maybe more, we are not going to see any friendly relationships, because if you remember, let's say about Poland, there was a republic, Rzeczpospolita, in 18th century that were split between like countries around Poland, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, and the Poland or civilians from Poland still don't have like friendship, nice relations with the Russians. The Baltic states don't have the same nice relationship with the Russians. So I believe that, and it's more than 100 years passed since those events. If we're talking about Poland, about little less, of course. But anyway, I believe that we are not going to see any nice relations between Ukraine and Russia for the next 100 or 200 years. And this is the worst benefit ever we could discuss about Russia. The Russians have lost, if they sign any agreement, any peace agreement, and I believe that this is the worst case for the Russians, and they've lost the Ukraine forever. Because after signing anything, I believe that they won't be able to start this war one more time. They will be able to do this only in case if the Western countries' power will be reduced by somehow, some way. I don't know how this can happen, but this is the reality. But if we compare the situation for the Russians, because during the previous years the Ukraine was involved in the Western process, we can say that maybe the Russians got as much as possible from this situation. They got at least some territories, and they reduced the risk with Crimea. So maybe they got as much as possible in this situation. Maybe because if they haven't started this special operation, the Ukraine anyway would enter NATO or European Union, and in this case the Russians would have more problems than they have right now. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.